Hello everyone, and welcome to my YNR official 24 channel. No one never expected that the weight of the truth would come wrapped in something as small and ordinary as a phone, yet that was exactly how the night unraveled, with the rain tapping against the windows of the Newman Ranch like a warning he had ignored for too long as he stood frozen in the hallway, staring down at the sleek black device he had found wedged behind the loose panel in the study desk, a phone that wasn't his, wasn't Nick's, wasn't Victor's, and most disturbingly of all, wasn't registered to anyone at all, a burner, anonymous and deliberately hidden, humming faintly in his palm as though it already knew it had been discovered, and in that moment Noah felt a shift deep in his gut, the kind that comes right before a life fractures into a permanent before and after, because he already knew, he just knew, that whatever secrets lived inside that phone would lead straight back to Matt, and likely straight through Sienna, whose haunted eyes and brittle smiles had been haunting Noah for weeks, ever since she'd returned to Genoa City with too many answers prepared and too many questions she refused to ask. His thumb hovered over the screen as the phone vibrated once, then again, an incoming message lighting it up with a single word, now, and Noah's breath caught as memories flooded back in jagged flashes, Matt's easy charm, his calculated generosity, the way he always seemed 10 steps ahead of everyone else, including Victor, including Jack, including Noah himself, and before he could stop himself Noah unlocked the phone, the passcode absurdly simple as if Matt had wanted it found eventually, and what spilled out wasn't just proof of manipulation or financial crimes or corporate sabotage, but something far darker, something that made Noah's hands shake as he scrolled through encrypted messages, voice memos, photos taken from impossible angles. Surveillance footage of rooms Noah recognized with a sickening certainty, including the safe house Audra had sworn was secure, including the playground where a little girl Noah had only seen once, Audra's daughter, had been laughing just days before she vanished, and as the realization hit him full force Noah staggered back against the wall, the air leaving his lungs as though he'd been punched, because this wasn't leverage or strategy or some twisted power play, this was systematic cruelty. This was control perfected into an art form. This was Matt documenting his dominance over lives like trophies, and the final nail came when Noah opened a voice memo dated just hours earlier, Matt's voice calm, amused, and chillingly intimate as he spoke Sienna's name like a lover's caress and a jailer's threat, reminding her what would happen if she ever tried to leave him, if she ever told Noah the truth, if she ever forgot who owned her silence, and Noah didn't remember moving but suddenly he was out the door. The phone clenched so tightly in his fist his knuckles burned, the drive to Sienna's place a blur of red lights and pounding rain and rage that threatened to blind him, because every mile brought him closer to a truth he wasn't sure he could survive, and when he finally burst through her door without knocking, Sienna screamed, spinning around from the kitchen counter where she'd been clutching a mug with white-knuckled terror, her face draining of color the instant she saw the phone in his hand, because she knew exactly what it meant that Noah had that phone, that the lie she had been drowning in for years had finally surfaced, and for a long, excruciating moment neither of them spoke, the silence stretching until it became unbearable, until Sienna's legs gave out beneath her and she sank into the chair, her entire body shaking as tears spilled freely, violently, like a dam breaking after too much pressure, and Noah's anger faltered, twisting into something rawer and more painful as he saw the woman he cared about unravel before him, not defensive or manipulative or calculating, but broken, utterly and completely broken, and when she finally spoke her voice was barely more than a whisper as she said his name like a confession and a plea all at once. Noah. I never wanted you to find out like this, and he stepped closer, holding the phone out between them like evidence and a lifeline, demanding to know how long, demanding to know how deep it went, demanding to know if anything about what they'd shared was real, and Sienna let out a sound that was half sob, half laugh, shaking her head as if the weight of it all had finally crushed her resistance, because there was no point anymore, no safety left in silence, and so the truth came pouring out of her in a torrent that left Noah reeling, the terrible truth about Matt that she had buried so deeply she'd almost convinced herself it was normal, that it was survival, that it was love twisted into something unrecognizable, how she had met Matt years ago when she was vulnerable and desperate and alone, how he had seen her fear and fed on it, offering protection that slowly became possession, help that turned into control, How every kindness came with a price she didn't understand until it was far too late, how he had isolated her from everyone she cared about, rewritten her reality piece by piece until she couldn't tell where his voice ended and her own began, how he had involved her in schemes she didn't fully grasp at first, made her a courier of secrets, a keeper of lies, and eventually a weapon, because Matt didn't just want obedience, he wanted complicity, and Sienna's tears fell faster as she admitted that she had been the one to plant false evidence, the one to deliver messages, the one to misdirect Noah and Audra and Kyle when the walls started closing in, not because she wanted to hurt them but because Matt had shown her proof, over and over again, that he could destroy anyone she loved in an instant, and Noah's chest tightened painfully as she confessed the worst of it, the thing that finally broke her, the night Matt ordered her to stay silent while he orchestrated the kidnapping of Audra's child, the way he'd framed it as necessary, as leverage, as the only way to ensure loyalty from everyone involved, and how Sienna had screamed at him, begged him, threatened to expose everything, only for Matt to calmly hand her that very phone and show her live footage of her own sister tied up in a room she didn't recognize, reminding her that he always had contingencies, always had a backup plan, always had someone's life in his hands, and Noah felt sick as Sienna collapsed forward, sobbing into her hands as she admitted she had helped him cover it up. That she had told lies that allowed him time to move the child, to disappear without a trace, that every night since she'd been living with the sound of that child crying in her dreams, waking up gasping and convinced that she was just as guilty as Matt himself, and when she finally looked up at Noah her eyes were red and swollen and stripped of every last illusion, and she told him she understood if he hated her, if he turned her in, if he walked away and never looked back, because she deserved it, because she had become everything she once swore she'd never be, and the room seemed to spin as Noah processed the magnitude of it all, the manipulation, the abuse, the way Matt had woven himself into their lives like a parasite feeding on trust and fear, and for a moment Noah said nothing, because he was fighting a war inside himself between fury and compassion, betrayal and understanding, because he could see now that Sienna wasn't the mastermind he'd suspected, but another victim caught in Matt's carefully constructed web, and when he finally spoke his voice was hoarse and shaking, telling her that what Matt had done to her was monstrous, that he had broken laws and lives and boundaries in ways that went far beyond corporate intrigue, that he would pay for it, and Sienna's breath hitched as she clutched at Noah's sleeve, terrified that believing that would only make it hurt more when Matt inevitably proved them wrong, because Matt always won, didn't he, Matt? Always escaped, always turned the tables, always made sure someone else bled first, but Noah shook his head, gripping her hands firmly, grounding both of them in the moment as he told her that this time was different, because this time Matt had made a mistake, he had underestimated how much evidence he'd left behind, how many enemies he'd created, how far Noah would go when a child's life was at stake, and as the storm outside intensified Noah made a decision that would change everything. Telling Sienna that they were going to the authorities, that they were going to Victor, to Nick, to anyone who would listen, and that the phone was just the beginning, because Matt's entire empire of secrets was about to collapse, and Sienna's sobs turned into shuddering breaths as hope, fragile and terrifying, flickered in her chest for the first time in years, even as fear clawed at her, because she knew Matt would feel it the moment control slipped from his grasp, and sure enough the phone vibrated again in Noah's hand, another message lighting up the screen, this one longer, colder, unmistakably Matt, reminding whoever held the phone that some truths were buried for a reason, that loyalty was rewarded and betrayal punished, and Noah deleted the message without hesitation, slipping the phone into his pocket as he pulled Sienna into an embrace that was part comfort, part promise, part shield against the darkness closing in, and as she clung to him, crying harder than she ever had. Sienna finally understood that the terrible truth she had been running from no longer owned her, that speaking it aloud had cracked Matt's power, and somewhere in the city, in a place Noah could not yet see, the game had shifted, the hunter had become the hunted, and Matt, for the first time in a very long time, was about to realize that secrets, no matter how carefully hidden, always find their way into the light. The night did not end with that embrace, because nights like that never do, they only stretch and deepen, unfolding consequences layer by layer until dawn feels like a stranger, and as Noah and Sienna pulled apart there was a new tension in the room, sharper than fear, heavier than grief, the awareness that truth once spoken cannot be contained again, that it demands action. And Noah moved with a sudden urgency that startled even himself, pacing as he began organizing the chaos in his mind. Pulling names, places, timelines out of the wreckage Matt had left behind, while Sienna sat rigid on the chair, arms wrapped around herself as though bracing for an impact she had spent years anticipating, because even now, even with the truth out in the open, Matt's presence felt omnipresent, like a shadow that refused to retreat just because the light had shifted. And Noah asked her questions gently but relentlessly, about safe houses, intermediaries, shell companies, aliases Matt had used. The kinds of details that could save a life if they moved fast enough, and Sienna answered through trembling breaths, her voice growing steadier with each confession as though naming the horrors robbed them of some of their power, admitting that Matt had always planned for this moment, that he kept redundant systems in place so no single betrayal could fully destroy him, that the phone was only one thread in a vast web. But even as she said it, Noah could see something else in her eyes. Something that hadn't been there before, a fragile sense of agency, because for the first time she wasn't trying to protect Matt's secrets, she was dismantling them, and when Noah finally stopped pacing and knelt in front of her, meeting her gaze, he told her that none of this made her irredeemable, that coercion was not consent, that survival did not equal complicity, words she had never allowed herself to believe. And she broke again at that, the tears quieter now, heavier, like grief finally given permission to exist, and as the minutes ticked by the storm outside began to fade, the rain softening into a distant hiss that mirrored the strange calm settling over the room, a calm born not of safety but of resolve, because both of them knew what came next would be dangerous, irreversible, and as if summoned by that thought, Noah's phone buzzed with a call from Nick. His voice tight and urgent on the other end as he demanded to know where Noah was and why Victor's security team had just flagged unusual activity tied to a series of offshore accounts they'd been monitoring, accounts that suddenly made sense in light of what Noah now knew, and Noah didn't hesitate, telling Nick everything in clipped, urgent sentences, hearing the sharp intake of breath when he mentioned the burner phone, the surveillance footage, the child. And when Nick swore under his breath Noah knew this had crossed a line even the Newmans wouldn't ignore, and within minutes plans were forming, meetings arranged, wheels turning that had been grinding in place for too long, and when Noah ended the call Sienna looked at him with a mix of awe and terror, realizing that the world was moving now, that the machinery of power she'd been trapped beneath was shifting, and she whispered that Matt would know, that he always knew, that he would retaliate. And Noah didn't sugarcoat it, telling her yes, he would try, but that they would be ready, because this time Matt wasn't pulling strings in the dark, he was exposed, and exposure changes everything, and as dawn finally crept in through the windows, pale and uncertain, Noah insisted Sienna pack a bag, just the essentials, because staying put was no longer an option, and as she moved mechanically through her apartment she was struck by how ordinary everything looked. The couch where she'd sat pretending she was fine, the photos she'd avoided looking at too closely, the life she'd tried to maintain under Matt's watchful eye, and with each item she left behind it felt less like loss and more like shedding a skin that had been suffocating her for years, and when they stepped outside the air was cool and clean, the city washed raw by rain, and for a moment Sienna allowed herself to imagine a future where Matt wasn't the unseen author of her choices, where fear didn't dictate every breath. But the illusion shattered when a black sedan rolled slowly past them, its windows tinted, its presence unmistakably deliberate, and Sienna froze, her heart slamming against her ribs as she hissed that that was his car, or one just like it, and Noah pulled her close, his eyes tracking the vehicle until it disappeared around the corner, his jaw set with a determination that bordered on feral, because now the threat was no longer abstract, it was immediate, and they moved quickly, slipping into Noah's car and merging into traffic, unaware that several blocks away Matt was standing in a sleek, minimalist office, staring at a monitor displaying live feeds that suddenly went dark one by one, his expression shifting not to panic but to something colder, something calculating. Because Matt didn't rage when things went wrong, he adapted, and as his assistant hesitantly informed him that certain accounts had been frozen and certain contacts were no longer responding, Matt smiled faintly, recognizing the sensation for what it was, resistance, and murmured that it seemed Noah had finally found the courage to dig where he wasn't supposed to, and that meant it was time to remind everyone involved why fear had been such an effective tool for so long. And back across town, Noah delivered Sienna to a secure location arranged by Victor's team, a place bristling with cameras and guards and protocols, yet Sienna still flinched at every unfamiliar sound, every shadow, because trauma doesn't dissolve just because danger is temporarily held at bay, and Noah stayed with her longer than protocol allowed, refusing to leave until she slept, really slept, curled in on herself like a child who had finally exhausted every last ounce of terror. And as he watched her, Noah felt the full weight of what Matt had stolen, not just from Sienna but from everyone he'd touched. Time, trust, innocence, and that anger hardened into something purposeful as he turned away and stepped into the corridor where Victor and Nick were waiting, their faces grim as Noah handed over the phone, watching as Victor's expression darkened with each piece of evidence, because Victor Newman respected power but despised those who used it without honor, and what Matt had done crossed even his ruthless lines. And Victor promised, quietly but with absolute certainty, that Matt would not outrun this, not with the combined force of law enforcement, corporate pressure, and Newman resources bearing down on him. And as plans were laid and alliances formed, Noah felt a strange sense of clarity, because for the first time since this nightmare began the path forward was visible, even if it was lined with risk. And hours later when Sienna woke, she found Noah waiting, his presence a steady anchor as he told her they needed to record a full statement, that every detail mattered, and she nodded, fear still present but no longer paralyzing, because each truth she told now was a weapon against the man who had controlled her for so long. And the confession stretched on, exhaustive and emotionally brutal, but with each admission Sienna felt something loosen inside her chest, as though the walls Matt had built were finally cracking. And by the time she finished, the sun was high and the world outside was moving on, unaware that a reckoning was quietly gathering momentum, and news began to ripple through the city of investigations, subpoenas, sudden resignations, whispers of a powerful figure under scrutiny, and Matt felt it too, the tightening noose, the shrinking options, and for the first time his confidence faltered, not because he feared exposure, but because he recognized the pattern of a game turning against him. And in a private moment, alone with his thoughts, Matt replayed Sienna's face in his mind, the way she used to look at him with a mixture of devotion and fear, and wondered when exactly he'd lost her, because he had always believed loyalty could be manufactured indefinitely, and he underestimated the resilience of truth, underestimated how far Noah would go when pushed beyond his limits. And as warrants were prepared and safe houses raided, Matt initiated his final contingency, setting events in motion that would force a confrontation. Because if he was going down, he intended to drag everyone else with him. And when Noah received the message hours later, a single set of coordinates and a chilling promise that the child Audra was searching for was still alive, for now, his blood ran cold, because Matt wasn't done, not by a long shot, and the battle ahead would demand more than evidence and confessions. It would demand courage, sacrifice, and a willingness to face the darkest parts of themselves. And as Noah looked back at Sienna, who stood straighter now than she had in years despite the fear still etched into her features, he knew there was no turning back, because the terrible truth she had finally confessed was no longer just a burden, it was a catalyst, and whatever awaited them at those coordinates would determine not only Matt's fate, but whether redemption, once thought impossible, could truly be claimed. Noah didn't tell anyone else about the coordinates right away, not even Victor, because something in Matt's message felt personal, deliberate, as though he were carving out a final, private battlefield meant only for the people he believed he still owned. And as Noah stared at the numbers glowing on his screen, he felt Sienna step closer behind him, her voice barely audible as she said she knew that place, that it was an old industrial property Matt had once mentioned in passing, a place he called the vault, where problems were locked away until they stopped making noise. And the words sent a chill straight through Noah's spine because they stripped away any lingering illusion that Matt's threat might be a bluff. And for a long moment they stood there in silence, the weight of what lay ahead pressing down on them both, until Noah finally nodded, his decision made, telling her they would go, but not alone, not unprepared. And Sienna surprised herself by insisting she come too, her hands shaking but her gaze steady as she said she was done hiding, done letting Matt decide what she was strong enough to face. And Noah saw in that moment how far she had come since the night before, how confession had transformed fear into resolve, and as they prepared to leave under the watchful eyes of security, Sienna paused at the door and took a deep breath, knowing that whatever waited at the vault would force her to confront the darkest chapter of her life head-on, but also knowing